Yeah, just going to go through some housekeeping rules. So during the presentation, if we can all be on mute, there's a chat box in case anybody has any questions. There'll be a Q&A at the end, so we can revert back. We will also be sending out a feedback form as well during the end of the presentation, so it'll be good to get your guys' feedback for future events. And yeah, trying to make this as interactive as possible. So yeah, please do ask questions towards the end, and Oonagh and Nicola can answer them the best they can. We'll do the next slide. Obviously, all of you know pretty much who I am and what I do at Trilogy, but as a reminder, I provide contract resources across financial institutions, mainly across the first and second line of defence. Over the last 6 months or so, most of you have met me and engaged with me, so I really appreciate you taking the time to join today. I got the idea of this event series. AI is obviously a word that's been thrown around the market quite a lot, different shapes and different forms. There seemed to be a bit of confusion around what AI was and how best to utilize it across your respective organizations. And I know some of you are actually looking at how to introduce AI to your businesses. So I really just wanted to provide a platform where everybody could network and maybe learn a bit more about AI and how it could be an integral part of all of your organizations. So this is going to be in a future event series that I'm running. So this is the first one. So again, thank you for all taking part. Have two really credible, really highly passionate co-hosts today, in Oonagh and Nicola, that are taking the time to run through this with us. So I will hand over to them to let them introduce themselves.
Thank you very much, David. So everybody, thank you so much for attending today. Firstly, apologies in advance. I lost my voice earlier this week, so it's a little bit hoarse today. So we're going to be talking about leveraging AI specifically for enhancing KYC, CDD, and client onboarding. It's really important before we begin that AI is kind of an umbrella term for a multitude of underlying kind of, artificial intelligence processes and concepts. So we're kind of going to break that down specific to kind of KYC, CCD, and client onboarding. But before we start, let me please take a moment to introduce Nicola Poole. For those of you not familiar with Nicola, she's probably one of the most esteemed and recognized kind of customer onboarding, client processing leaders within the industry. I've met her a number of times over the past few years, an incredible woman, but also an expert in her field. So Nicola, I'll just pass it over to you quickly just to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Yes, thank you, Oonagh. A wonderful introduction there. Maybe too nice to me. Anyway, I've been in the industry for quite a long time in various banks, and my main focus has been in first and second line processing, transformation, and client experience. So I've run organizations that have managed the end-to-end client journey from prospect right the way through to offboarding. And I really have a passion for the fintech innovation that we're seeing today, and how that really impacts both the processing and the operational execution and our production, as well as our client experience. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that with you today, and obviously going through what we do on a day-to-day basis with these tools.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicola. And I think that's a really nice segue into kind of the first discussion point. Obviously, everybody on today's kind of webinar will be familiar with the challenges, but before we started throwing around kind of the concept of AI and AI became prevalent in the industry, there were a number of challenges in KYC, manual verification, operational costs being high, both for day-to-day and also remediation and backlogs, inefficiency and delays, most importantly impacting the customer experience, which ultimately is what we're trying to streamline and improve here ultimately. And one of the things we haven't mentioned here obviously is compliance cost, operational costs. Compliance risks obviously embedded in processes that are weak in terms of controls, and also some other aspects, fraud vulnerabilities and data security concerns. So I don't know, Nicola, if you want to take a couple of these points just in your experience and talk to what the embedded challenges were from your perspective.
Yeah, I guess one of the biggest really is the manual nature of the KYC onboarding process. And I think that probably will resonate with a number of the people on the call. You know, the process of onboarding a client through your internal infrastructure to get them to good to trade, if we're talking in a financial institution perspective, has always been a number of people, a number of stages, a number of processes, and a huge amount of document and data. And that's never been, I've not seen any organization 100% have an automation solution for that. And that is in many years of doing KYC, there hasn't been a solution. So I think the manual processing has to be probably one of the biggest challenges, which ultimately leads to that high cost that we see.
The only exception I have to say that I have seen, I say exception because you're absolutely right, there's not one part of it that could be completely removed, but you know, Singapore is a great example where they've been able to take use infrastructure from public sector perspective, where all of the local companies and people, permanent residents and Singaporean citizens, it's all captured in the government system. And that actually was then built into, for example, DBS, the Development Bank of Singapore, their onboarding process for individuals or natural persons, as they call it. It's actually 2 minutes. All the person has to give is a copy of their ID, and then they just have to log in to the portal for the public system to approve acceptance of the account opening. But the problem we have, you know, last year I was on a panel with the FCA, and we spoke about this as well, Nicola, was in the UK, we can't do this because we don't have a central depository from a government perspective. And the FCA's response was, we're absolutely, you know, handcuffed here because we can't actually do anything in that regard from a UK perspective because it's a government initiative. It's not an FCA-owned initiative. So I think from a UK perspective, this is not going to change anytime soon. And, you know, whilst we can see the economies of scale and the efficiencies that have been obtained, Scandinavia, Singapore, we're not going to be able to translate that aspect to the UK in the near future.
Yeah, and I think listen, in a retail environment or maybe online banking, challenger bank environment, the ability to be digital in the client journey is absolutely out there. However, that is for the most basic setup of those accounts. As soon as you want to do more complex products, or you want to add in, you know, savings accounts or start transferring to unusual locations, you're going to get asked for more document and data, and it's going to start creating manual processing that happens behind the scenes. So what you might see as a digital user of a platform is one thing, but behind the scenes inside the bank or inside the payment firm, there is some manual processing still, you know, and I think that's the point. Yes, it can be minutes. But you're right, data from a external source perspective or a repository perspective would be a solution. But I guess it would only be a solution for when you're banking in your own region. As you say, for Singapore, you can bank, you can onboard in your own region, but you couldn't therefore create, you know, onboard to a branch in another location. So it is challenging.
Yeah, and global onboarding, you know, I'm not sure how many people on today's call will be familiar with the concept and also whether you'll be needing to utilize it anytime soon. But as businesses expand, especially fintech and crypto firms, you're going to have to look at global onboarding models and look at potentially super equivalent requirements from a KYC perspective that exist in other jurisdictions. And the challenge you have as well is sometimes it's the language that has been used in various legislation. Also, as well, coming back to the points that were made there in respect of processes. Earlier on, Nicola talked about, you know, individual processes at the onboarding stage. I remember a number of years ago working with this large international bank where client onboarding was taking up to 3 months. And this is for kind of corporate clients. So obviously slightly more complex in terms of documentation requirement. And when we broke it down, we discovered that the underlying process for onboarding had 72 individual steps, none of which were simultaneous. So before you even jump to a discussion on AI, I think it's important, if you are having challenges with client onboarding, go back to basics and look at your step-by-step controls. Are they holistic in respect of, have you looked at it holistically? Have you understood, whether there are any advantages of simultaneous documentation being obtained? And obviously there's basic steps of automation there that could also be done. But, I think sometimes when people see challenges with client onboarding, especially delays and inefficiencies, they immediately jump to, we need an automated solution, but sometimes it could actually just be your underlying control that needs to be reviewed.
Yeah, I would say one of the foundational steps is understanding your own internal policy and making sure it's harmonized and standardized, and so that country to country, if you are a global organization, that you are standardizing your activity for onboarding, and that different countries or different platforms that you may have, or product onboarding processes that you have inside your firm, don't have a different approach. Because one thing I think AI will bring and will be measured on is that client experience element, because obviously time to market is one of the key wins from an AI perspective.
Absolutely. There's a question here from Nicholas. Is there clarity around the levels of documentation linked to banking services? And I suppose, Nicola, one of the first things here obviously is assessment of client suitability in different products, which is first and foremost. But do you want to add anything additional to that?
Well, I guess that comes down to that point around standardization and your policy, right? There is differentiating document asks at product level. You can't get away from that. Derivatives will have a much higher demand for regulatory data than potentially a cash management product, which may be a cash management product which is opening an account, will have regulatory requirements, AML, money laundering requirements, and fraud requirements. But your derivatives will have all of the Dodd-Frank, MiFID, EMEA requirements on top. So every product in investment banking generally has a differing documentation ask, which all goes into that new to bank onboarding process.
Absolutely.
And adds complexity.
My favorite is syndicated lending, and I'm being sarcastic. It literally is the most tiresome and tedious onboarding process when you're onboarding potentially 9 banks simultaneously. And yes, there's various tools that we can use to obtain certain documentation, but it's especially when the drawdown suddenly is activated and we're told we have 24 hours to do this. It's always fun and games. But anyway, luckily you have Bankers Almanac in most circumstances to help with that, but there still is other documentation. But it's absolutely valid points, Nicola. There's different requirements in different products depending on jurisdictions as well. If the client is a US client, you're going to be looking at different. We have to make certain assessments. There's going to be reporting requirements as well. Nicholas, does that answer your question? Go ahead.
Your due diligence will also bring through further information, i.e. you might identify a sanctioned person, sanctioned activity, you might identify adverse media, you might identify PEP. There's going to always be your initial requirements gathering plus those extra requirements that you may find on the journey.
Absolutely. And it's never black and white. Like, whilst you can have a list of prescribed requirements for every product, there always will be nuances along the way with clients as well.
And the amount of times the business may have asked exactly the same question that Nicholas just asked there, which is, what are the requirements? What can if I want to onboard in this country for this product, what do I need? And there's always a caveat when we give them that list, because we don't know what we're going to find when we get the detail back. Absolutely. And that can be frustrating for both the banker and the client.
So moving to, and Nicholas, if you have any further questions for that answer, just let us know. So
okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you can also just speak. Brilliant. So AI use cases in KYC, there's kind of seven key areas that we're seeing AI being utilized within the KYC client onboarding environment, which are on the screen now. So machine learning is basically where the machine is, and this is kind of more so around kind of transaction monitoring, where it's looking for trends and patterns within the client activity. So it's taking historical data in the account and kind of looking through that. Natural language processing kind of speaks for itself. That's basically where it's taking kind of spoken form data, and systems are kind of interpreting human language. So a lot of that's used in chatbots, for example, that we're seeing. Again, we can support client onboarding with that. The robotic process automation is more automating repetitive tasks for manual data entry. And again, we'll talk a little bit around ways in which data needs to be validated and how that can be used. Biometric authentication speaks for itself. It's basically looking for facial recognition. We're seeing that being used a lot in fintechs, crypto firms, challenger banks, as Nicola mentioned earlier, where for client onboarding purposes, people are holding up the passport and then they're visually on the screen and the system is using biometric authentication. And in my opinion, it's working pretty well. There are some glitches in the system which are being ironed out. In terms of predictive analysis, again, it's taking historical data and using statistical algorithms to forecast future trends. This can also be used for kind of peaks and troughs in your kind of client onboarding. So especially for larger institutions, what times of the year are we seeing increases in client onboarding? When are we seeing peaks in and troughs in kind of KYC reviews, so that we can actually better articulate resourcing requirements and system needs at those periods in time as well. And it should statistically then be able to give us a better understanding of not just resourcing requirements, but also as well in terms of how we can maybe realign some of the review periods so that we can better perform from a client perspective. Cognitive computing kind of looks through kind of complex decision making. And obviously from a KYC perspective, this is taking all of that data dump of your KYC documentation that's being provided by your clients and basically just going through it to make sense of it and build up a profile of your client. Where this is going to be incredible is in private banking transaction monitoring, in my opinion. Creating actually transaction monitoring across the globe, and creating basically every single one of your clients will have its own characteristics, products, services, how they're using their account, how they're utilizing different products and services within your organization. And a lot of banks are currently moving towards the life cycle management of the client. Going on the journey with your individual clients and your corporate entities in terms of products they're going to need during their life cycle. So individuals, so buying a house, buying a car, investing for your pension fund for your future, supporting your kids through schools, university. And what this system will actually do is it will look across the board. It will look at how you're using their account. So is there any changes in your characteristics? Is that an identification of potential fraud? Or is it an identification of the fact that you need new products and services? So again, this is where beautifully kind of fraud and customer servicing dovetails in together. An identification of a change in a client profile is not necessarily identification of risk. It could be a cross-selling opportunity. And that's where cognitive computing is the future of our client lifecycle management. And that's one area I'm really excited about. And then last but not least, blockchain technology. Whilst not strictly AI, and I think it's important to talk about that, we're talking here about the security and immutability, the unchangeability of KYC data within the systems. We've also been seeing, sorry, my apologies. In Singapore, we saw a really, really interesting experiment. I say experiment carried out where they used blockchain technology to look at ways in which we could improve trade finance. basically information documentation requirements. It worked beautifully onshore. The challenge is once it moves offshore, who's going to own the actual depository, etc. Nicola, do you want to add anything to that before I choke here?
No, I think what's really interesting is the cognitive computing. I think that's one that's going to be a huge benefit across businesses. You know, we're here talking about KYC, but actually that's going to take data collected at KYC and or through account opening processes, and you'll be able to share it across your business to make other, as you say, marketable you know, cross-selling opportunities. So I really truly believe that's going to be a real benefit in the future.
Absolutely. And then when you bring these all together, you know, the question is, you know, will we always need compliance officers? The answer is yes. You're always going to need a human to basically answer questions on pertaining to risk. But if you couple kind of the cognitive computing together with the blockchain storage functionalities, and then bring in kind of NLP and biometric, you basically are moving towards a completely automated system that is facing the client. What we would then be doing in the background is assessing the real risks
exactly.
that have been escalated.
And I think it's going back to your compliance second line, you know, teams and people becoming real risk managers.
Absolutely.
Versus, you know, a lot of them are having to filter data to get to the bottom of where they need to be from a risk perspective, what they need to know from a risk perspective. And I think that is the benefits of AI in the future, totally taking our people back to being qualitative versus, you know, that data filtering person.
And I'm actually really excited about it. You know, it gives us back purpose and removes a lot of the admin. You know, I believe across the board compliance processes should be approximately 70% automated. We're far away from that because of data challenges, because of, you know, our operational, or especially with older organizations, the
brownfield technology.
Yeah, like the code is, you know, 40, 30 years old in some organizations. We also have multiple systems which are operating across the landscape, which haven't been assessed. This is something, again, I see time and time again. You buy new systems for certain use cases, but do you look holistically at the functionality of those systems across the board? You know, are you duplicating efforts in that regard as well? One of the so Dilip has commented, I think the importance of data quality at both input and output is essential as this will reduce the level of rework. AI aside, the human involvement is critical, 100%. And data is key here. Before you can even think about AI, before you can even think about automation, you need to clean up your data. You need one source of the truth. And in many organizations, the challenges that I've seen both in-house and when I've been in a consultancy perspective is you go in and you ask for data and you actually then discover there are multiple sources of truth. So before you can even do any work to remediate, even reducing the cost of your compliance in manual processes, you need to fix data. I'm sure, Nicola, you see this all the time.
Yeah. And actually, but what I would say is AI could actually be your first touch point for data. You know, you say about data entry there, Dilip, but I guess what you can be using AI to do is to source that data, screen that data, and extract that data so that it's the manual process of extraction and input is removed. And then, yes, there's no question that you might have to have someone to, you know, even actually, to be fair, AI is being used to assess data and give you an outcome. Yeah. And so therefore the outcome is then what may be assessed by a human interaction. But all of that admin that happens to source, extract, input would be automated and you know, assessed by an AI. What comes out is then quality checked by somebody who has the ability to take a risk-based decision.
Absolutely. And on the screen now, Nicola and I have kind of put together an overview of different use cases for AI within KYC. And it is across the board. You know, as you saw earlier, the underlying answer is, can KYC be utilized for the front-to-end process? 100% yes. for the process. But as Nicola has reaffirmed just now, the most critical importance here is A, the system needs to learn. So it's going to need somebody behind the system to learn and to teach it. And secondly, you know, where key risks are identified, they will need to come back to an individual behind that. So,
Yeah.
Nicola, if I may ask, obviously, from an industry perspective, we've seen a number of use cases. For me, the most exciting one, whilst not specific to client onboarding, but rather kind of ongoing account, you know, monitoring, is the HSBC transaction monitoring example, where they've actually utilized the Google AI for, sorry, apologies, moving another slide, where they've actually utilized the Google AI for transaction monitoring, which has revolutionized their understanding of risk in their book. But I don't know if you want to talk to a few of the other use cases that we've seen.
Yeah, I guess some of the things that we're seeing today, you've got, as you say, you've got HSBC who have a dynamic risk assessment that they've built, which is taking all of the data that they hold internally and externally on their clients and being able to assess that on a continuous basis to be able to trigger when something changes that would prompt them to take a different approach to their client risk, whether that be for increasing business or potentially offboarding, or, you know, whatever it may be, doing a full review of the clients so that they can make sure that they're still in a place that they want them to be from a client perspective. So some of the other solutions that I've seen out there is Citi, for one, is using AI to actually, as I said earlier, source documentation. So on a search and discovery in a KYC solution, they would go out using the AI to go and source data, both internal and external, do a review of that data, extract information that is relevant to the case that you are onboarding for, and then put it into your system. So they're using it to actually interpret the data, extract it, and set the analyst off on their journey informed versus having to go to manually get that. A lot of that is probably automation, but there is a lot of AI capability in that. I think other areas are very much being used in the credit risk environment versus in the KYC, but a lot of people are exploring AI to be their solution for, and are using AI for their solutions for transaction monitoring, as we said earlier, being able to discount alerts that come from screening hits and transaction monitoring hits, so that actually all of the noise, the false positives that come out of the process, are discounted automatically through the AI capabilities, driving better sort of automation for the process, and giving the analysts the core data that they need to analyze.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Wells Fargo and DBS, we mentioned HSBC already, but both of them are utilizing AI for KYC and transaction monitoring as well. And they've been, it's been quite well known within the industry about what's going on there. So if you want any more information, anybody on today's kind of call about the specific use cases by the different organizations, and some of it obviously transcends outside KYC. It's for customer interactions, fraud control, etc. Please just reach out and we can send you the list. Challenges in implementing AI. I think we've touched on data quality, and obviously it was mentioned already by Dilip in the chat room. But obviously there's some other challenge areas as well. And Nick, I don't know if you want to touch on some of these with regards to, for example, cybersecurity, data privacy, expertise.
Yeah. I mean, the expertise, I think, is key. You know, we are all new to this, and we have got to upskill everyone on how to use AI, how to test AI, how to have visibility, see beyond, and how to train AI to do what we need it to do. We need to build teams who understand what the governance framework is required for AI. We've got to understand the ethical balance that is required for us to be able to be effective with AI. So I think all of those things are so important. It's got, and our regulators, while still early days of looking at this, they're going to expect you to be able to explain and interpret what you've built and be able to understand it so that you can measure controls and put a governance framework together around it.
And pertinent to that, actually, Singapore last week, was it last week or the week before last, the regulator announced that they're going to be putting in place regulation around the AI space, which is one of the first that we've seen from a global regulatory perspective. And so that's going to be a very interesting use case to keep an eye on, because we should expect a knock-on effect. We've previously, where the UK and the US made regulatory change, we would see the knock-on going over to the likes of the UAE, Singapore, Hong Kong. We're now beginning to see, especially in the kind of crypto AI space, this is actually coming backwards instead. So do keep an eye on Singapore specifically for that. So what are the next steps that organizations need to take in terms of implementing AI solutions? There is an entire process here, an entire change management process. And as Nicola rightly pointed out, the first step is understanding. Before we even think about AI implementation, it's what is it that we actually think that we could utilize AI for within our existing landscape, and what is the foundational work that actually needs to be done before we would even look to consider the potential engagements of external models. Somebody asked me earlier today, actually, whether or not I would recommend people going out today to find AI solutions in the market, or should we wait a couple of years till they become more advanced? I don't think there are Google AI is a good example, but there are very few third-party providers that currently do provide pure AI solutions because of its infancy. And any ones that claim to provide AI solutions, it will be a part of the bigger package, and a lot of that will actually just be sexy automation. I'm just going to put it quite bluntly. That's what it is, and in some cases not so sexy. So just be mindful of that. So should we be waiting to see how the market develops? No, I think what you should be doing is assessing what you think, based on the different AI functionalities, where you think potentially AI could be incorporated into your framework, and then begin the groundwork for that build. And in some instances, it may be even, many of you, in today's call come from fintech and crypto firms. Speak with your engineers, you speak with your developers. You'd be so impressed about what they can actually do, rather than you developing stuff off the shelf. A couple of engineers I've worked with didn't like the fact that they thought that we had to buy a sanction system, and were able to develop their own, in a matter of days. These guys are so bloody good at what they do. So think about what you're going to be able to develop in-house, rather than jumping out to an off-shelf solution, which is not going to be bespoke to your individual needs. Sorry, Nicola, I'll pass it over to you.
I was going to say, in doing that, I think building a committee or a group of people who, from each of your stakeholder groups in your organization, to be the sponsors of any AI solutions, so that actually when you're choosing AI, you're choosing an AI capability that you could use across areas in your organization. I think people are going for AI solutions that are for one particular process, and actually there is no benefit in doing that. You want an AI solution that you can use across your firm, and that has multiple use cases, but your governance framework around that needs to be at such that you have everybody to the table who are making those decisions, who are actually doing the assessment, are training, and having the ethical view on what's the right thing to do for your business and your clients.
Absolutely. Holistic risk management is the way forward. We did break down the approach to risk historically, and I don't disagree that was needed. It was needed to understand and fine-tune op risk, compliance risk, credit risk, market risk. But absolutely to what Nicola is saying, now we're in an environment where in order to best service our customers and best mitigate our risks, we need to be holistic in our approach. And buying segmented, siloed system solutions for specific processes is not the way forward. To make sure that if you want to reduce costs, you want to automate and you want to improve the customer experience, it needs to be holistic. A great example is, lending facilities. We review credit every 6 months, and some of the documentation requirements in credit are the same as would be required from a KYC perspective in a periodic review. Why aren't we providing both to each department? Well, because the departments don't speak to each other, and then it's just an inconvenience to the customer. So customer is centric here, risk is centric, and we need to look holistically at how we can best service the customer, reduce costs and long-term sustainability of our businesses as well. And this is the language that we need to bring into many of our compliance conversations whenever we speak about AI use cases. Nicola, there's a question. How do you compare AI providers and their solutions to assess what constitutes good?
I think that's a difficult one, because actually I think that, as Oonagh said, there's a lot of providers out there that may be just sexy automation tools, not necessarily purely AI tools. And I think when you're looking, as I said, look at them for multiple solutions, understand what you want to solve internally, do that foundational step, as Oonagh said, understand your risk, understand what you want to solve for, and then you'll be able to assess the capabilities out there for those. But try not to be buying one for each solution. Look at something that can do it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of obstacles to AI implement, Ray, I hope that answers your question. And if not, please feel free to elaborate on it in the chat room. There are going to be obstacles to AI implementation in every organization. We've touched on those already. There is always going to be an underlying ROI, return on investment uncertainty. Will you get the tangible benefits of the investment in the technology? But as Nicola's point earlier was on holistic risk. If you are buying an AI product specific for one purpose and you haven't assessed the wider use case in the organization, your ROI, it's not uncertainty there. You're already disadvantaging yourself from the get-go. There's also going to be cultural resistance, because there's this preconceived idea that AI is going to take away people's jobs. That's not the case. It will, of course, reduce the cost of compliance in terms of resources for manual processing. But what it won't do is remove the need of experienced risk advisors for key risks. And that is where I potentially see the cost of compliance increasing, because there are a limited number of people within the industry that have that intrinsic understanding of risk in an advisory capacity. So the cost of compliance, i.e. the salaries of compliance officers in this regard, are going to increase, in my opinion, going forward. And we're going to see a lot of people needing to upskill much more readily and quickly and in a much more in-depth way to support the risks and the more complex risks that are going to be identified by these systems. Would you add anything to that, Nicola?
No, totally agree, Oonagh.
So what can an MLRO or a compliance officer do to improve their understanding and upskill in terms of AI? It's pretty self-explanatory. Collaboration with data scientists. Many of you are working in fintech and crypto firms. I loved my time working in one of the global crypto firms, because I got to work with engineers every day. And what I learned from them was just mind-blowing. Some of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life. And they made me rethink how I think about compliance as well. And it was really just incredible to be able to bring that historical compliance experience into a pure tech environment, and then work with engineers to understand how we could better utilize not just automation, but bringing in more advanced tools into this space. Industry events and conferences speak for themselves. In all honesty, I wouldn't pay a lot of money for industry events and conferences, because all of the good stuff will be published afterwards. But these are great networking opportunities. And I'm always of the opinion, if you can take one thing away from a conference, whether it's a new connection or whether it's information you've obtained, it was definitely worth the investment. But hands-on experience, that's going to be limited, obviously, in this case, because you haven't yet utilized or used the functions, and there will be that scarcity in that you will, it's not used widely, but there's also that fear factor of using it too. But education and training is going to be of the utmost importance. And Nicola, to your point earlier, cross-functional collaboration.
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
Okay, so on that note, really that's it in a nutshell. We can leverage AI-powered solutions in the KYC, client onboarding, CDD space for identity verification, risk assessment, fraud identification. We can streamline processes, reduce manual workloads, but there is a lot of foundational work that needs to be done before we can even get there. The great news is you're all in the perfect space to be able to take this forward. Well, I say especially those that are working for tech companies that have been built from a tech perspective. So your fintech, your crypto firms, these are optimal candidates for this functionality. And the challenge we've had to date is we've seen a lot of kind of move back to manual processes because that's what we know. And innovation has been limited because of regulatory demands, because of just day-to-day work within compliance. We need to change that mindset. We need to move towards innovation. We need to move away from manual processes, and we need to think more holistically about how we can incorporate this. Nicola, I don't know if you've got some final comments or words on that too.
No, I guess, listen, everything you've said is correct. And I think AI, using AI, you just got to take the opportunity, do your homework, as you said, do the foundational steps, and start inquiring around how it might help you, what you can do better, and work with your peers to find those solutions. So definitely, they're the things that I would be advising people to do day to day. Absolutely.
Well, is there any other questions then from anyone in the chat room at all, or anyone on the call? Anybody got any questions? Okay, Chris, have a good day. Chris has to drop. David, is there any questions from your side?
Yeah, I guess just speaking to everyone whilst I was setting this up, I guess a lot of the reservations around AI is the security and what protection there is in place in terms of the information provided. So I think you touched on data security specifically, but in terms of the actual measures that you can put in place, is there anything further you can elaborate on there? Because I know a couple of people are doing it in their organisations presently, so that might be something worth touching on.
I suppose if the first and foremost is, I think cybersecurity and data privacy are kind of hand in hand. If you're using a third-party provider, you need to think about what access to information they're obtaining and make sure from a legality perspective, you're not contravening any GDPR requirements, etc. You need to look at the storage as well of information, and importantly, what those companies are going to use with that. Will that information be stored idly, or potentially will they be using it to improve the functionality of the system? And if so, in what ways are they processing that? So that's really important as well to understand that when you're working with any of the newer AI firms. Where the information is being stored as well is of paramount importance in some instances. Some firms have tried to create a kind of ring fence from the US for various purposes. So, is the storage of the data going to be in the likes of Europe or potentially LATAM or onshore in the US? And that's very important as well. So for some of your clients' needs, you'll need to assess that. And many of the tool providers that I've seen actually give you options on that. And then cybersecurity. I suppose that's more to do with kind of people hacking into your system, but given the AI functionality, the AI system will be continuously learning, but what else is that system able to do, and how can that potentially infiltrate other systems? So we don't know as yet in terms of how these systems are going to work within our tech environments, and we need to be very mindful to ensure that our existing controls for security are actually preventing the data within the systems. Nicola, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think, again, your CTO, your CISO are the key people where it relates to the data governance and the privacy rules that you need to deploy within your own organization. You know, some of the AI technologies that if you're housing them internally, are just sitting over your own data lakes and your own EDM systems. So I guess the ones that create most of the uncertainty are those that are cloud-based, and data isn't necessarily housed on your own framework as such. So I think working with your CISO and CTOs are going to be key to an understanding the legality country by country, as Oonagh just alluded.
Yeah, and one of the things working with engineers has taught me, as compliance officers, we're trained to find solutions. Your engineers are trained to find problems in the code. So every solution you give them, they will find a problem with it. So you need to work with that as well. But it's a fun journey, I can tell you that much. David, Grace, is there anything additional?
No, as I said, just conscious of time. Thank you for that. Really informative, and again, appreciate everyone joining. I will be sending out a feedback form, which would be great if you can all take part and feedback to us so we can improve on future events. And if anyone wants to set any follow-ups or follow-up conversations, I'm sure Nicola and Oonagh will be more than happy to do that.
100%.
Absolutely.
Welcome that.
Always happy
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Nicola and Oonagh. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
you.
Wonderful.